Morning, friends. We're on Chapter 50. Now It's Your Neighbor's Kid, Nashville, Tennessee. Out on the northwest side of Nashville, Tennessee, Judge Seth Norman has come to expect phone calls to start pouring in around late January every year. The legislature comes back in session in January, Norman said. The calls come from state legislators, each with the same problem: an addicted son, a daughter, or a brother-in-law. My nephew down in Camden. You think maybe you might be able to help? I get those kinds of calls, he told me, while we sat in the office adjacent to his courtroom. Most of the country's 2,800 drug courts are set up to divert drug abusers away from jail and prison and into treatment somewhere. Seth Norman runs the only drug court in America that is physically attached to a long-term residential treatment center. He takes addicts accused of drug-related nonviolent felonies, theft, burglary, possession of stolen property, drug possession, and puts them in treatment for as long as 2 years as an alternative to prison. Down the hall from his court are dorms with beds for 100 people, 60 men and 40 women. I visited Judge Norman's Nashville facility one overcast fall afternoon because this epidemic was not the same as those of the past. For the first time since the years after heroin was invented, the root of the scourge was not some street gang or drug mafia, but doctors and drug companies. I went to visit Judge Norman because I wanted to see what changes widespread addiction to a drug usually associated with the ghetto or barrio might have wrought in America now that virtually all the new addicts were rural and suburban white people. Seth Norman is 80 and possesses snow-white hair, a genteel southern manner, and a drawl to go with it. He started the drug court treatment program in 1996 and built it almost single-handedly by scrounging beds and ovens and lawnmowers from Tennessee state surplus. Part of his efforts included frequent visits to the state legislature, where his pleadings for more funding fell on deaf ears for a good long time. Norman would go to the lawmakers about his figures. The drug court and long-term treatment could keep most addicts out of prison, saving the state $32,000 a year over what it cost a prison to house an inmate. The drug court, he would say, boasted a recidivism rate of only 20% among those who finished the treatment program. Compare that with over 60% for those leaving prison, he told them. This was before the pill and heroin epidemic swept through. Most legislators took drug treatment for soft-headed do-gooderism and held to the lock-em-up attitude that voters preferred in the red state like Tennessee. If Norman's experience is any guide, however, that hardline attitude has softened recently. It's taken 16 years to convince the legislature that it is cheaper to put them in drug treatment than to put them in prison, he said. The cost savings weren't what did the trick, though. Treatment has always been more effective and cheaper than prison for true drug addicts. What's changed, Norman said, is that no longer are most of the accused African-American inner-city crack users and dealers. Most of the new Tennessee junkies come from the white middle and upper middle classes and from the state's white rural heartland. People who vote for, donate to, live near, do business with, or are related to the majority of Tennessee legislators. As the opiate epidemic mangled the middle class, these kids doped up and dropped out. Earlier generations of opiate addicts became self-employed construction workers or painters, because that was all they could manage with heroin and often jail in their lives. With the new generation, time would tell how they would do, but it wasn't looking good. A large subset of these new young addicts had criminal records now. Many were on probation, a good number went to prison. Either way, their parents were realizing that life with a record was as stunted as life with an opiate addiction. Any dream these kids' parents once had for them were now improbable. Even qualifying to rent an apartment was hard. With a criminal record, finding a job in the teeth of the Great Recession was almost impossible. Some parents were so worn out that they welcomed a child's departure for prison. But the opiate epidemic also made a lot of criminal justice reformers out of rock-ribbed white conservatives. This is what Judge Seth Norman discovered. The experience had, shall we say, modified state legislators' hardline attitudes toward the proper role of rehabilitation in dealing with addicts accused of drug and property crimes. One thing that makes legislators more amenable to treatment is that it's hard to find a family now that hasn't been hit by addiction. Started out 15 years ago, very few members of the legislature had them. Now, ain't nobody in my family going to touch anything like that. Not so anymore. Now they have seen it firsthand. Norman's no dummy. He named several dorms of his treatment facility for friendly legislators: Haynes Hall, Henry Hall, Waters Hall. When I visited, he claimed the support of the sitting governor and state directors of corrections, public safety, and substance abuse. Norman couldn't have imagined this when he was scrounging surplus sofas and coaxing pennies from elected officials in the late 1990s. But as the opiate epidemic ravaged white communities across Tennessee, it had a way of changing the minds of even the hardest hardliners. Signs of this were quietly appearing nationwide. The opiate epidemic was forcing judges to imagine new kinds of courts, veterans' courts, mental health courts, designed to treat the causes of what landed a suspect in a criminal case. In Ohio, the opiate epidemic had swollen the prison population beyond capacity. Prison director Gary Moore, appointed by Governor John Kasich, a Republican, told a newspaper that he favored expanding prison drug treatment, but had done so in 4 prisons. He also suggested that he would resign if the legislature decided to build more prisons in response to the epidemic. Republicans across the country, in fact, seemed to be changing their views. In Texas, Georgia, South Carolina, and other states, GOP lawmakers were pushing for what the Wall Street Journal termed a more forgiving and nuanced set of laws. You're seeing this huge groundswell for criminal justice reform really being driven by conservative circles, said Chris Deutsch with the National Association of Drug Court Professionals. Conservative governors are starting to invest in drug courts. In the last 5 years, we're really starting to see statewide drug courts in every county. Texas opened drug courts and was able, therefore, to close prisons. Kentucky Congressman Hal Rogers, a staunchly conservative Republican, has become a strong proponent for drug courts since his district, which included Floyd County, had been hammered by prescription pill abuse. The epidemic of illegal drugs is by far the most devastating thing I've seen in my more than 40 years of public service, Rogers says on the front page of his website, where he also touts the 30 drug courts in his 24-county district. Kentucky state legislator Katie Stein, a Republican, introduced a bill as I was writing this book that made it easier to charge a heroin dealer with the death of someone who died from an overdose. But key to Stein's bill was increased funding for addiction treatment and education. You used to think, oh, the heroin addicted, that would be someone in a back alley, someone I don't know, Stein told a local TV station. Now it is your kid. It's your next-door neighbor's kid. Georgia Governor Nathan Deal heard recovering addicts tell their stories at graduation ceremonies from the drug court where his son is the presiding judge. They all have their own stories, but a common thread runs through all of them, Governor Deal told the Journal, explaining why he had tripled the number of drug courts in 3 years. They were given a second chance, and they had been rehabilitated. Several factors made this politically feasible in states like Georgia. Declining crime rates were certainly one. Stressed budgets during the Great Recession were another, though treatment has always been proven cheaper than incarceration. Yes, the fact was that coincidentally or not, this change of heart was happening among conservatives just as opiate addiction was spreading among both rural and middle-class white kids across the country, though perhaps most notably in the deepest red counties and states. Drug enslavement and death, so close at hand, were touching the lives and softening the hearts of many Republican lawmakers and constituents. I'll count this as a national moment of Christian forgiveness, but I also know that it was a forgiveness that many of these lawmakers didn't warm to when urban crackhead users were the defendants. Let's just say that first-hand exposure to opiate addiction can change a person's mind about a lot of things. Many of their constituents were no longer so enamored with that tough-on-crime talk now that it was their kids who were involved. So a new euphemism emerged, smart-on-crime, to allow those politicians to support the kind of rehabilitation programs that many of them had used to attack others not so long ago. Meanwhile, buoyed by his new purchase with Tennessee's political class, Judge Seth Norman had done some thinking. 4 or 5 drug courts like his could be funded with a 1 penny tax on every prescription opiate pill sold in Tennessee. After all, some 400 million of the pills were prescribed annually to a state of 6 million people. By the time I was leaving Nashville and heading again to Portland, where I had heard a Jalisco boy was just sentenced for the death of Toviev Senyayev, the Russian Pentecostal kid, no drug company had stepped up to endorse Norman's idea. Have a good day, friends.